Thank you, Asta. While our lovely panellists are getting seated, I will introduce them. So at the end, we have Tom, and Tom Barber is a program manager at the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. This is a new initiative that's promoting collaboration among experts from the international policy communities. In the middle, we have Sarah Ramantanis, who is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Young Australians in International Affairs. And alongside that, she is also the Head of Marketing and Communications Manager at the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute based here in Melbourne at the University of Melbourne. And then we have Jonathon Chew, and John is one of the world's leading market analysts in international education, and he's currently the Global Head of Insights and Analytics at Navitas. So thank you for joining us, panellists. And today we are discussing leveraging soft power for regional stability. So I think a good place to start is to define soft power, how it relates to your work, and why is it particularly important in this current geopolitical environment. And Tom, I'll throw to you to get the policy standpoint.
Cool. Thanks, Georgie. I guess, like probably a lot of people in here, I did a uni undergrad in kind of politics and international relations. And, as part of that course, you kind of read a bit of Joe Nye, and he's really the person who kind of popularised this concept of soft power. And I think I really find his articulation of it pretty compelling. So he contrasts soft power with hard power. So, economic sanctions or, military force, those kinds of things, which is really about compelling or forcing or, making countries or actors do what they otherwise probably wouldn't want to do. And so, soft power in contrast to that is really about the power of persuasion, the power of attraction, having those kind of ideas or culture or something that really other countries can kind of... I guess if hard powers are pushing out influence, then soft power is really kind of trying to pull it in. So they're both about influence, but one of them is really about... soft power is really about that persuasive piece. And I guess, why it's kind of important at the moment, we've heard a bit today, it's a bit of a cliche, but, we're in a really competitive world. And countries like Australia, you really need to try to use all the kind of national levers of power that they can. And, soft power really fits into that too. It's not a magic bullet that you can all of a sudden fix all your problems with, but it's one tool among many that really can help to maximise influence of a country that, in a more competitive environment.
Thank you, Tom. John, I'll throw to you. So how do you think about soft power and how that relates to your work in international education, which is something that's come up in nearly every panel today?
Thanks, Georgie. I also came across the Joe Nye definition, but I'll use a definition that's closer to my heart. I moved house recently, and in the process of moving house, left behind my neighbour. His name is Van, and he is a wise, kind, compassionate, elderly gentleman who was constantly mowing my lawn out the front. And to me, that's soft power. Like the things I would do for Vern because of who he is and what he's invested into me and my family over the years, just by being there and, these little acts of service. I think it's more important than ever, Australia's role in being that kind of good neighbour, because we've been through a pandemic, and when it comes to international education in particular, there were things that we did which made us good neighbours, but for international education in particular, we did not really live up to that stewardship responsibility for all these young people who are here in our country and who were going through as hard a time as all the rest of us were, with lockdowns and family back home going through all sorts of issues. We sent the wrong messages. We didn't extend JobKeeper to them. We didn't give them JobSeeker. We even told them to go home at one point. So there's a lot to make up for.
That's a very human level, I suppose, characterisation of soft power, which, Sarah, it's probably a similar experience for you, working with young people and in your various roles. How are you thinking about it?
I don't have the same definition as the same people up here, but I will say from a youth perspective, as international trends continue in a negative direction, Australia is uniquely placed to use our ability to persuade and influence through our soft power. As I look around the room, all I see is emerging leaders that come from a range of different multicultural backgrounds, and we're all here because we probably undertook some world-class education, which has been a reoccurring theme that we've heard as one of our soft power strengths throughout the day. So these incentives not only play an important role in fostering collaboration, but as well as seeking peace for a lot of the global crises that we're facing today. As a young person, you know, in my opinion, not speaking on behalf of all of them, I don't remember a time where we weren't facing a breadth of global crises, and it can feel sometimes like there's a sense of hopelessness for our futures. And, you know, one thing that I feel that is an inevitable solution is ways that we can seek peace throughout our soft power.
Thank you. Tom, let's go to you now and talk about, so two of the key motivating ideas that underpin your institution's work are the need for the use of tools of statecraft and whole of nation approach. So how does soft power sort of feed into that? And do you want to talk us through this whole of nation approach?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we've heard a bit about it today, actually. It's been really good to see, like, most of the panels have had a breadth of people from across different sectors on them. At the beginning, Anthony mentioned it, and Michelle talked about it too. So just to kind of, to give you an idea of like what AP4D is kind of working with there on those. So all tools of statecraft is obviously about kind of coordinating the different government departments across government, making sure that, you know, there's a bit of coherence across that. So, you know, whether that be, you know, Defence, Department of Defence, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, kind of trying to ensure that they're working together to the same strategic objectives, and there's the underpinning idea is ideally that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Whole of nation kind of steps out from that, and it encompasses, you know, the whole of society really. So, you know, we've heard about education, we've heard about science today, you know, trade, private business, the media, arts, sport, like the whole breadth of Australian society really. There's all these different communities, all these different sectors that engage with the outside world that, you know, are the face of Australia in many ways. The whole of nation includes the kind of core policy actors, but it also includes these actors. And I think, you know, when you hear me list off those kinds of sectors, you can see that those, like, that is really the wellspring of where soft power comes from. You know, governments can try to manufacture soft power. It doesn't really work. It can backfire as well. It can be counterproductive. And the whole point of soft power, I guess, is that it persuades. For something to be persuasive, it has to be authentic. It has to be genuine. It has to be able to convince people that they, you know, agree with it or think it's something good. So, you know, for that to happen, it kind of has to be organic, I think. And really the main institutions that can generate that organic soft power are those kind of whole of nation actors. So I guess that's kind of where it fits in, and that's why, you know, a whole of nation approach has to recognise the role that, you know, outside of government communities and sectors play, has to kind of support that, and then it can leverage, you know, that soft power that comes out of it.
Can you give us an example of a successful example of that sort of genuine approach that's then resulted in effective soft power, if you will?
Yeah, I guess we've, and I don't want to kind of cramp anyone's style if they're going to talk about this too much.
Don't steal John's thunder.
Yeah, I won't. But like, I'm sure someone will speak about the Colombo Plan, that's one. But, you know, in terms of the Women's World Cup last year, you know, that's banking on Football Federation Australia, that's banking on the individual players, that's banking on, you know, the private sector supporting it, that's banking on the Indigenous artists who they use like for the branding and things, state governments, all these different actors came together and really put on a great spectacle and showcase Australia to the world. So I think, and I'll probably come to this a bit later, it's hard to measure soft power. So, you know, it's not like you can say this, like soft power increased by this much because of that. It's more of a, you know, to quote like the castle, it's the vibe of the thing, I guess. So, yeah.
I think the World Cup's a brilliant example of something that everyone sort of experienced on some level, and that everyone was amongst it and all of those sort of things. So John, how about in terms of education, how is soft power related to that? And we've also seen some shifts in regulation recently with caps changing and everything, and then that sort of feeds into a whole other geopolitical story. So can you walk us through a bit of that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come back to the caps in a minute, but just on the question of international education as a tool for soft power. So there are lots of parts to international education. I'm going to focus on the biggest part, which are the students coming here to study. Obviously, there's internationalization of the curriculum, there's exchange, there's Monash Malaysia, RMIT Vietnam. All of that sits under international education, but the big part are the students that come here for a transformative life experience. And in my mind, that is a soft power gift. I mean, you don't get something more sort of precious than that, where a young person says, I'm not just going to come and visit your harbour bridge, I'm not just going to come watch your sport, I'm not just here for the art or the culture. I'm going to put in a lot of investment at a good chunk of the best years of my life, the most formative years of my life, and I'm going to immerse myself in your culture, your values, your public discourse, your conversation, the protests that you feel worthy about protesting about. It's just this incredible gift where, we have a really precious few years with these young people who come here, and actually they allow us to shape them. In fact, they say, I'm choosing Australia. The world is my oyster. I can go anywhere to study. And I'm choosing you, Melbourne, to be that formative force in my development. So I think that's really huge. In terms of the recent discourse around the caps, I think it's really unfortunate that at the same time we had all the students come back, we also had a housing crisis, and it was just too convenient, I guess, to put two and two together and say, that equals that. Too many students resulted in not enough houses, when we all know students take up 4% of the rental market. These issues predate the student recovery. But we've got two caps now, basically. One is a cap by stealth. It's really difficult to get a visa at the moment if you're an international student. That's a big issue. That is damaging to soft power because it undermines the trust in our systems, the transparency of how we do things, the values, our welcoming messages gets completely undermined when you put your visa in and you've got to wait weeks and weeks and weeks and you don't know what's going on. There is a different talk about caps, which is about how do we manage the international system, the international education system, so that it's more sustainable. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a bit that lots of institutions are worried about, but in actual fact, I think we've had a pretty unmanaged system develop over time. Only 1/3 or so of our international students come through the university sector. There are a whole bunch of other sectors which have sort of cropped up, which effectively, in some cases, not really a student experience. It's about coming to Australia. It's about working part-time. And that's really diluting international education. So a cap in that respect, I think, would be a good thing for soft power and what we're trying to convey.
Mm-hmm. So, John, your piece is about people coming and experiencing Australia. And then on the flip side of that, I suppose, there's been a push and a boost of investment of getting Australians to experience parts of Asia through programs like the New Colombo Plan, which I've been a recipient of, which was an amazing experience. Got to go to Myanmar in 2019. So, Sarah, do you think that young people are engaged in Australia and wanting to pursue those kind of opportunities?
Yes. At Young Australians International Affairs, we have about, I'd say, 60 to 50 volunteers on average, and majority of them are actually, New Colombo Plan alum and things like that. So there is a clear interest in the Asian region. The New Colombo Plan is one of the most robust opportunities for young people early on in their career to build institution and people-to-people links within the region, as well as not just travelling to their country of choice, but exploring so many other countries in the Asian region as well. It is wise for the government to continue investing in initiatives like the New Colombo Plan to strengthen economical ties for the upcoming generation of leaders in this space. And young people through the New Colombo Plan are also learning that Australia's economic future is very closely linked to Asia, particularly through countries like China, Japan, South Korea and India. So it's a worthy investment for Australia's economic future to carry out initiatives like NCP.
Do you think that young people are maybe as interested in Asia as they are in Europe or the US even? How's the wrestle between maybe those two opportunities?
From my experience at this organisation, I'd say at the moment the trend is more steering towards Asia because there is a likeliness of being able to provide policy solutions that affect our country more so than particularly US and Europe, particularly in the current climate. I mean, something I constantly hear around the sector in regards to the US, it can be, just a negative space for young people to innovate, just given, the upcoming election and things like that. So I think they are steering towards countries where change can happen and is more likely to happen in the short term, but also where there can be an intergenerational lens on solutions as well.
Absolutely. And programs like the New Colombo Plan are just so effective. Even now, it's been something that's just changed my whole career trajectory and everything. Let's throw forward to maybe future engagement. And Tom, can we talk about some challenges that Australia are facing in leveraging soft power?
Yeah, so I think probably I might focus just on two. The first is probably, I kind of alluded to it before, it's really hard to measure. So it's kind of intangible. Like you compare that to, hard power stuff. You can look at a country's budget, how much they spend on the military, like what the amount of sanctions were on a country A for doing something the country didn't like, that kind of thing. That's not to say that material is everything. Obviously there's, a spectrum there, and some things that happen in the kind of hard power space are still kind of intangible. Like if it wasn't that way, then any country that was the most powerful would just do what they want and always get their way. But I think, for the sake of argument, soft power is, it's much harder to measure. I know earlier on to start today, we heard from Sharon from the Yusof Ishak Institute, and she talked about a survey they did kind of with elites in Southeast Asia, looking at things like soft power. So there's ways that you can try to measure it, but they're qualitative, they're not quantitative, and they give insight, but it's because it's inherently a subjective thing, right? Something soft power, the influence of soft power on someone is going to differ between people, just like it will between countries. So it's really hard to objectively measure it. That said, I don't think you need to be able to measure it. I think it's the type of thing that, you respect it for what it is. It's something that is constantly under the surface that, a government can kind of help cultivate the space for those whole of nation communities and sectors to kind of build it. It's something that can, it might help if you want to do trade negotiations or something. It might be the cherry on top that pushes the deal, or it might be something that helps the negotiation start from a better point to begin with. So it's not something where you can develop a specific piece of soft power for some specific problem and deploy it. It doesn't work like that. But if you're not thinking of it like that, I think that's okay. The second piece is probably, and John kind of touched on this before, is coherence. So if you're having a national policy that's working against soft power and undermining it, that's like not helpful, obviously. John was talking about the kind of visa stuff in education, but look at in the Pacific, Australia's domestic energy policy is really undermining historically, like the efforts to position ourselves as Pacific family. We're a signatory to the Boy Declaration, which emphasises the existential risk of climate change, but we're still digging up and exporting coal. So those kinds of things. There's no magic bullet to fix that, but it's something to be cognizant of. And I think even the cutting of the ABC's budget, that meant that Pacific Broadcasting from Australia came down right when China was kind of increasing theirs. So that's like a shooting ourselves in the foot in that sense too. So I think it's strategic coherence across government is hard to do. It's not easy. If it was easy, it would have been done. But I think be aware of that, and there are ways to kind of try to deconflict, and just kind of beginning with dialogue with different parts of the country, different parts of civil society, those kinds of things. So there's that dialogue between government and civil society and whole of nation actors, just to kind of get an understanding of where are the areas that kind of undermining could happen or is happening, and trying to make sure that it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, Tom's just mentioned climate change, and then we've talked about a couple of other challenges, I suppose. But how do you think young people can help to enhance the effectiveness of certain strategies to sort of drive soft power initiatives, and what's the best way to get young people involved? You mentioned before that Asia could be a breeding ground for innovation. Can you talk to that a little bit more and what lies ahead?
One way I think young people can get involved quite naturally, not just within the sector, but more broadly, is strengthening our digital diplomacy and working with the government to strengthen their digital engagement strategies. So young people have the potential to maximise the capabilities of social media platforms because they've been working in them for so long. They really understand their power, and they have the bandwidth to keep up with the trends. I mean, every odd year there's a new platform that comes out. I actually I'm not up to date with them myself because they're so fast paced for me, and I can find them quite distracting in that sense. But if we want to keep going, back engaging with young people as they're younger, one way is through digital diplomacy, and it can highlight these global issues, i.e. climate change, share educational resources, and positively shine a light on Australia's initiatives on a regional and international stage. Not only that, but young people are in a time where an entrepreneurial mindset is taking the stage, so they could work in establishing partnerships with Indo-Pacific countries to create tech innovation hubs and startup incubators, so that they can position Australia as a leader in technology and innovation. I think there is space for the upcoming generation to be proactive in this space as well, and really championing Australia in owning that too. And it could help solving regional issues through collaborative tech solutions that don't exist yet, and that can only happen by working with young people, whether solely or an intergenerational approach.
Just back to education. So you talked about the caps as being possibly a positive for soft power, and then on the sidelines we were talking about a negative could be that international students, or even students in general, may have become a bit of a commodity. So what are some other ways that using education as a tool of soft power can become more effective?
Yeah, I think we've got to live up to the promise, right? And I think there are three parts to it. The first part is we've got to take the education component very seriously. This is effectively what students are coming for. Students are actually arriving in Australia with far greater needs than they have previously, right? So in Australia, we closed our businesses and we kept our schools open during COVID. We've got an entire generation in Asia where their parents had to work and they had to stay home from school. So there is a generation of students coming through now with much higher academic, social, and other needs, and we've got to be responsive to that. I think part of taking the education seriously is getting rid of these ghost colleges, right? These colleges that actually don't offer real career trajectories. They offer you, a ticket to Australia's labour market, effectively, and that has diluted and that has commoditized international education to a great extent. So that's part one. Take the education part seriously. I've already talked about take the guardianship seriously. I mean, these are young people. Some of them are vulnerable. They come with mental health challenges. We've got, issues around consent and sexual predation on campus. These are all part of the things that we need to take much more responsibility for. And if we get another pandemic, hopefully we'll know what to do. You know, we'll be able to support the students in a really meaningful way. And then the third part, actually, Georgie, is take the pathways to citizenship seriously. So we know that 1 in 6 international students will actually become an Australian at some point in the future. And we don't like to talk about that. We prefer to sort of have a gatekeeper sort of mentality and say, you know, you're not worthy until, you know, finally you tick all the boxes and you become a permanent resident. And even then, we don't talk about citizenship. It's just about whether you can stay or whether you have to go home. Whereas I think other countries like Canada do a brilliant job at saying, you're all newcomers here and we can't wait for you to become part of the fabric of what makes Canada, Canada. And I think Australia needs to take that, needs to do a lot better in that respect as well.
Thank you. I think now's a good time to throw to the audience. Do we have any questions on the floor? We have one at the front. We have a few questions.
Hi, thank you so much, panellists. My name is Vivian. I work at Macquarie University's Global Leadership Program. And I have a question for Jonathon, but also keen to hear from the other panellists as well. So just reflecting on what you've just said, you know, we speak about soft power sort of at this global outlook, but how do you think we can use soft power here in Australia to shift, I think, some of the mindset, you know, we're seeing, and Sarah, you alluded to it as well, we're seeing now this kind of populist, anti-globalist, anti-intellectual narrative that is really shaping some of the policies when it comes to international education, migration, people coming in, and we see its effects really playing out on university campuses with talks of, you know, ANU recently, you know, deported a student for participating in a protest. So we're seeing this play out, you know, in real time. And I'm curious to know what all of you think. What kind of soft power initiatives can we employ here in Australia to change this kind of anti-globalist narrative, which is, I think, very damaging? And all of us here are obviously here for a reason and we're quite supportive of the idea, but how do we use that soft power here in Australia to shift some of the mindsets that international students are either a commodity or a liability, or dangerous? And you know, mentioned Canada. Can you give me more examples, I guess, of how Canada is doing it better and what we can learn from them to employ here in Australia?
Great, thanks for the question. The first thing I'll say is, sadly, we're not alone. I think, as you've pointed out, lots of other countries have used international students as a scapegoat for housing issues, believe it or not, including Canada, including Netherlands, where we operate some colleges, the UK, you know, it's been that way since Brexit. I think the first part, to answer your question, is we need to get our social license back as a sector. I think there's too much of this acceptance that, you know, ghost colleges are just part of international education. And until we can win the trust back of the Australian community that this is a really high-value export, it is a huge cultural benefit, it is a huge soft power benefit. It is, you know, the top 4 exports for Australia, and I think it's number 1 in Victoria. So, and we would be number 3 depending on the gas price on any given day. So we're not alone. You know, we need to get our social license back. And then I think what the government's doing to say we're going to resize and reshape the sector, I think that is a positive. And what I'm hoping that what that means is about 1/3 of the commencements in international education are in the private RTO sector. And I'm hoping we'll go back to a world where the government will say, actually, universities, that's our real asset. That's why the students are really here. And we want that to be the centerpiece of international education once again. And I'm hoping that that's how it'll play out, and that could do wonders for our social license and acceptance in Australia.
We have a question down here.
Hi, my name is Ruhi. My question is for Jonathon. I work in the space of inclusion and human-centered design, and we're talking about power. My question is, how do we give power away? And with that, I mean recognizing that the power we hold as a country also means we have a responsibility to make the world an equitable place, and to do this without like a white savior mindset of let's help the global south and they don't need rescuing. We just need an equitable way to raise the floor such as that. So how do we give power away in that?
Great. Tough question. I think I really like what Matt said before about how soft power is about being authentic and genuine. And in some ways, that measurement issue is a huge issue, because once you start measuring it, it starts to feel very selfish rather than selfless. When it comes to international education, as I said, a big part of it are the students coming on shore, and to some extent that's tied up with all sorts of issues around brain drain and how we investing in those countries, it's become very commercial, it's become very financially driven. I think there are ways around that, and I think there are some fabulous universities that have gone the other way. RMIT Vietnam is probably a fantastic case study. So, they've been in Vietnam now for decades, and of all I guess the fees that they've raised, they've turned it into a $250 million fund that they'll reinvest back into the country. And I think there comes a point where I think universities do have that opportunity to give back and to actually demonstrate that it's not just about funding research that happens in Australia. That is extremely important. We wouldn't have the research capability we have here without those international students contributing to that. But also, how do we give back more directly? I think that's possibly part of the solution.
We have a question at the back.
Hi, I'm Jake here from Oricon. I've got a question for Tom. It's about sport as a asset of soft power. I saw recently there was a proposal for a Papua New Guinean NRL team. How effective do you think proposals like that are in, cultural export of Australia to the region, but then also, contributing to national security, through sport and other ways?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I've seen critiques of that, saying that the rest of the Pacific only really plays rugby union, and so it's really only targeted at Papua New Guinea. But it's a big country. It's got, I think they realised a few months ago that their census data was wrong, and they had about double the population than they thought. So it's a lot of people there, and Australia's got a long-standing kind of relationship with the country. I don't want to give a cop out, but it's so. I come back to it's hard to measure soft power, and I feel like something like this, it's you can give it 5 years, you can give it 10 years. You probably need to wait at least a decade to see what impact it's had, and even then, it's like, what's the aim? You know what I mean? Like, is the aim to just kind of build those people-to-people links? Because if that's the aim, then I think that it's a good idea if the NRL wants to expand there and the government is willing to kind of fund that. But I think in terms of you mentioned security, how does it contribute to Australia's security? I think it's really hard to draw a straight line between the two, because there's so many other kind of factors in the relationships and things like that. So, it's a tough question. It's a really interesting question, though, and you see a lot in the last couple of years too, the question of sports diplomacy and how that all works. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that proposal. I know Pat Conroy, the Minister for International Development, he seems pretty keen. He's a rugby league man, I think, so we'll see what happens.
Question over here.
Tom, I got one for you as well. I guess the question would be, just off Western Australia, we have a rising power in Indonesia. It's one that's fourth most populous country in the world. Soft power at the end of the day is still a form of state-to-state competition. What could we be doing there to strengthen that sentiment that we've seen as today is more aligned to China?
Yeah, I think Indonesia is a really, really important country, and I think one of the key ways we can try to leverage soft power. I get what you're saying when you say soft power can be a form of competition too, but when it's between two countries, let me rephrase it this way: if it was between us and China trying to influence Indonesia, I get there's definitely a competitive element there. But I guess soft power, just in the bilateral relationship, I guess it's less competitive in that sense because you're trying to kind of attract each other. And in terms of that, I feel like, I'm from Western Australia, and when I went to primary school, there was everyone nearly learned Indonesian in my primary school. So that's like a really, I think, low-cost way to try to increase the cultural literacy and things of people in Australia. I remember seeing a report a while ago saying that has just dropped off a cliff, really, people studying and learning Indonesian in Australia. So I feel like that's a good place to start. It just, then when people fly from Perth to Bali, instead of just buying a Bintang singlet and getting drunk, they can actually have a chat with some of the locals in their own language kind of thing. So, it's back to basics, I think, with soft power. Like I said before, you can't really target it at a specific thing, but if you build that baseline and you keep cultivating that, it'll have an impact down the road.
Could I just jump in and link back to how sports diplomacy is actually a strength of Australian soft power being utilised in Indonesia, particularly for youth? When I was doing some research in sports diplomacy, we're running an event in July to talk all about it. What I was observing is that there are a range of different community-led grassroots youth initiatives in Indonesia that encourage young Indonesian people to learn about AFL and understand that sport. I would say AFL is one of the biggest cultural importances here in Australia, and we saw that during COVID, it was actually one of the only things that was up and running and didn't change out of all the other priorities in the country. So I think that is a great way where, there isn't necessarily a threat, and it strengthens those people-to-people links with the Indonesian region at a very early stage in people's lives. And it's just something that we do really well. I think what Australia needs to be doing is capitalising on the things that we have that are unique, that are doing really good on an international stage, i.e. sports diplomacy, as well as our tech innovation, as was spoken about earlier today. We're spearheading that and we're going above and beyond in that realm. So why don't we leverage that to build stronger ties within the region?
I love this idea of sports diplomacy. And just to bring it back from one final question from me. So what do you see then, just a quick fire question, as Australia's edge in soft power, aside from the Matildas? John, you can start.
I'll keep it short. As I mentioned it already, our universities. We have 6 in the top 100 in the world. We really punch above our weight. I think we've got to be proud and put that front and centre.
Beautiful. Sarah?
I did have a think about this question, and I said sport because, again, we do it so well. And sport's one of those things where the language is actually unanimously understood around the world. Not many forums can do that. Math also does that, but we're stronger in sport. So I would say sports diplomacy for me.
And Tom, back to basics. What does that look like?
Look, I think just recognising that our multiculturalism is a real strength. It's not to say that there aren't things that can be improved and that should be improved, but I think, it's a strength in and of itself in a liberal democratic country with a really diverse population, but it also helps get those other kind of soft power strands out into other countries through diaspora networks, through international students, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Thank you. That concludes our panel on soft power.